Okay, so now we're going to be going into more depth on the white matter and gray matter in the spinal cord. We've already mentioned that these regions exist. So as a reminder, we talked about it here, that this region here, over here, up here, and also over here of the spinal cord is myelinated axon, so it is white matter. And that this region here that looks like a bit of a butterfly or a bow tie, that is dark matter, and that is going to be mostly cell bodies, certainly unmyelinated portions of the spinal cord. So we're going to talk about different subregions within the white matter and gray matter. And one thing that I would suggest you do, we talked about this in the beginning of chapter 12, but this diagram on page 387 shows the different divisions of the nervous system. Okay, and so particularly you need to know what's the difference between somatic sensory and visceral sensory. You need to know what's the difference between somatic motor and autonomic, which is another division of motor. Okay, because as we look at these regions of the spinal cord, we're going to be talking about those four distinctions: sensory, both somatic and visceral, and motor, both somatic and autonomic. Okay, so make sure you go back and review those in chapter 12 if you do not remember those concepts. Okay, so moving forward, let's talk first about the dark matter. We're going to be giving it structural names, which they're all gray horns, and then we're going to be saying what functions are found in each of these regions. So first let's point out the structures. Okay, again, this is showing a spinal cord section, so we see it right here. And let's point out a few structures. Okay, first of all, we've got the dark matter, looks like a butterfly. Okay, and then around it we've got the white matter. Okay, the lighter colored. This side over here is actually going to be posterior. That's the parts that's closest to those bumps on the back of your spine. Okay, the way that I know that is that the wings of the butterfly on the back end, a part of it always seems to touch the edge or get pretty close to touching the edge. On the front end, notice you don't have that wing touching that front edge. And so that's how I tell the difference between posterior side and anterior side. Now, again, here is the pia mater, the arachnoid mater, the dura mater that we know before. Here's this thing called the central canal. It's that hole right in the center of the spinal cord. We discussed it in chapter 14 in the brain, because cerebrospinal fluid will flow through this. It comes out of the fourth ventricle and into that central canal. And this central canal will go the entire length of the spinal cord. Okay. Now, you may notice we have this thing called anterior median fissure on the spinal cord. Let's look at the name. Anterior, that means it's closest to the front. Median means right on that midline. And fissure is a deep groove. And so you notice this deep groove. You can see some of that white space. And so that shows this very deep groove on the front side of the spinal cord. Okay. Then on the back side, we're going to have a shallow dip in. That's called posterior for the back, median for right down the middle, and sulcus for a shallow dip. Okay. Now let's look here at the dark matter in the different regions. So they're all going to be called gray horns: anterior gray horn, lateral gray horn, and posterior gray horn. Okay, so anterior gray horn is going to be up this region, lateral gray horn is right around here, and posterior gray horn is back here. Now these same structures are present on the other side, and they have the same names, anterior, lateral, and posterior gray horns. Okay. Now you may notice that the two wings of the butterfly are connected by a little bit of gray matter, and it surrounds this central canal. So the anterior gray commissure, if you remember commissural fibers, they connect one side to the other side. Okay. So anterior gray commissure, it's on the front side of the central canal. And then posterior gray commissure, it's on that back side of the central canal, and it connects the two wings of the butterfly, or the two large regions of gray matter. Okay, here's a cartoon representation, and it's the same thing. Let's go through these structures. Here we have the anterior median fissure. We know this side is anterior, one, because we have this deep fissure. Also because if we look at the wings of the butterfly, these get closer to touching the back side. We then have our gray horns, anterior, lateral, and posterior. We'll have the same on the other side. And this is where we get to some of the functions that you should know. Okay, so in the anterior gray horn, you are going to have exclusively somatic motor nuclei. Now remember, nuclei, when we're talking about these large structures in the brain or spinal cord, it's a collection of cell bodies. So that's what we're talking about here, that we have somatic motor nuclei, collection of the cell bodies in that anterior gray horn. Okay. Now for the lateral gray horn, which we can see in the blue and the light purple, we're going to have both visceral motor, which is also the same thing as autonomic motor, and visceral sensory. Okay. Remember, somatic motor is going to be going to your skeletal muscles. Visceral motor is going to be going to cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, glands, adipose tissue. And sensory visceral, okay, that is going to be sensations coming from your internal structures. And then finally in the posterior gray horn, we're going to have somatic sensory, okay? And so those are going to be the functions associated with each of those horns. So to get you started on your notes packet, if you go here, gray matter, the regions within the structure, well, for each of these, we're going to put anterior gray horn, you put lateral gray horn, and then finally you're going to put posterior gray horn. Okay, and so this says types of neurons or tracts. Well, we haven't talked about tracts, so it's neuron. Okay, and so for anterior gray horn, I'll get you started on this one. It is the somatic motor nuclei. Okay, and I'll let you fill these others in based on the information we just talked about. If there's other notes that you need to help you remember this, put them here. That's what that space is for. Okay, so we've talked about the gray or the dark matter regions, and so now let's turn to the white matter regions. Okay, and again, let's pull up this figure. Okay, so for the white column regions, or for the white matter regions, they're going to be called white columns. At least that's what your textbook calls them. Okay, your lab manual is going to call them a funiculus or funiculi for plural form, and that's fine. They both mean the same thing. Okay. So the anterior white column is everything in this region. The lateral white column is going to be all the white matter in this region. And then the posterior white column is going to be all the white matter in this region. Just like with the gray horns, you have the same structures on the other half of the spinal cord. Okay. Now, these white regions, they have myelinated axons, and those are either sending information up toward the brain or towards higher levels of the spinal cord, or it's sending information down from the brain or from higher levels of the spinal cord down. Okay. So what this means is if it's sending information up, it contains sensory information going in. And if it's sending information down, that means it has motor commands. So we are actually going to call these in tracks, which are going to be these bundles of nerves going one location or another. And so ascending tracks, which ascending means to go up, those are going to carry sensory information, while descending tracks carry motor command information. Okay, and both of these are found in the white matter. Okay, and so to help you on your filling out this last part of the basic sheet, we're going to have the anterior Y column. Okay, here we would have lateral Y column, and finally we're going to have posterior Y column. Okay, so the anterior white column is going to contain both ascending and descending tracks. The same is going to be true with the lateral Y column. But the posterior Y column is only going to have ascending tracks, which means it's only going to carry sensory information. Now, your lab portion is actually going to go through specific tracks and what specific type of information that they're carrying. It's going to give you more details, but for this portion, know this. Okay, and finally, I'd just like to point out that there are a number of activities here to help you learn what's in these different columns and horns. Make sure you look at these images closely and identify where's posterior, where's anterior as a starting point, and then go from there. And that's my